everyone, and welcome to our next episode of CIA, Catholic Investigative Agency. As we normally do for these, we have researched for hundreds of hours on this topic. We're talking about the Latin Mass, the Tridentine, traditional Latin Mass, the Tridentine Mass, and the Novus Ordo, a little history of how the Novus Ordo came to be, and why the Pope is making the traditional Latin Mass so much more available all of a sudden. If you're under 50 and you're in the church, a Catholic, you're sort of sitting there, what's all this about Latin Mass? I don't know anything about Latin Mass. Well, that's one of the reasons that we're doing this show, and a number of people in Rome are very interested in making sure that the message gets out about what is being called the reform of the reform, and we'll see a lot more of that as the years come along. You're going to see in the parishes in 2011 a good number of changes to just some of the responses that we make as people. That's all part of what's called the reform of the reform. We'll get into that a little bit later in the second part of our show. To give you an example of some of the research we did, all of these books up here and a number of articles, our research team, our crack research team has read various ones of these. We've had conference calls with people like Father Peter Stravinskas and Alice von Hildebrand. This is an exceedingly well-researched show, and it's hundreds of hours, articles, online articles, different major portions of these books, in some cases the entire books. So again, as we always tell you, we have hundreds of hours of research available. When you look at the final product here, the DVD of this, we will also have produced another information DVD that has all of the research on it, all the references to the books, the articles, all of that sort of thing. So again, we can't collapse 400 or 500 hours of research on stage here, not in the heat under these lights, but we sort of sum it up and give it to you in roughly an hour, and then hopefully you'll pick up the ball, learn much more about it yourself, and spread the word. I can assure you the Vatican and people of the Vatican want this reform of the reform being understood by the laity. So that's what we're going to get into now. We have a certain thesis. We begin every CIA show with a thesis. And our thesis for this episode of Catholic Investigative Agency is that certain individuals at Vatican II set about to destroy the theology of the Catholic Mass, which would ultimately destroy the Catholic Church. It's quite a bold statement. There's an old saying in the Church which sums up the connection between prayer and belief, and that is, lex orandi, lex credendi. It's translated, the law of prayer is the law of belief. Now, there's an intimate connection, a very intimate connection, between how we pray and how we believe. Since the purported aim of these individuals was to destroy the faith, they had to first destroy the prayer of the Church, the highest form of the prayer of the Church, which is the Mass, the holy sacrifice of the Mass. In fact, many of those involved with the deformation of the Mass were not bashful at all about their work. One priest, for example, Father Joseph Guilleneau, he was a Vatican II Periti, we'll get into that in a moment, said, "This needs to be said without ambiguity. The Roman Rite, as we knew it, no longer exists. It has been destroyed." One of the leading opponents of the drastic changes at the council, Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani, said, "They wanted to make a clean slate of the whole theology of the Mass. It ended up, in substance, quite close to the Protestant theology, which destroyed the sacrifice of the Mass." Now, these are all very high-ranking people at Vatican II. All the people behind the scenes, these are their comments. They knew what was going on. In the words of the famed and noted philosopher Dietrich von Hildebrand, truly, if one of the devils had been entrusted with the ruin of the liturgy, he could not have done a better job. So, let's present some history. In the 17th and 19th centuries, a heresy known as Jansenism began to appear in the Church, largely in France. Jansenism was tied closely in its outlook to sort of the Protestant understanding of grace and predestination and man's relationship to God. The matter of fact, Jansenism sounded very much like the Protestant revolt of Martin Luther and John Calvin. It was named after its chief proponent, a Catholic bishop by the name of Cornelius Jansen. This corruption of Catholic theology, which is what every heresy is, began to express itself in strange liturgical innovations like dancing at the liturgy and prophetic utterances. Sound familiar? About liturgical dancing, Cardinal Ratzinger said, "Dancing is not a form of expression for the Christian liturgy." Take that to your parish worship committees as a quote. Write that down. These new rites, the jumping around, the prayer, the prophetic utterances, and the theology behind them began to gain popularity among many Catholics in the pews as time went by. The populace, regular people going to Mass every day, every Sunday, began moving away from the liturgy and the ecclesiastical forms and the tradition. In the middle of the 19th century, a Benedictine monk by the name of Dom Guéranger, he was the founder of the French congregation at Solesmes, he set about wanting to revitalize an appreciation for the Mass, which at the time was the Tridentine Mass. It was the previous Mass for the 1300 years before that. It was the Mass. It was eventually codified by the Council of Trent in the middle of the 16th century. And remember, it was the only Mass there was. He's considered, Guéranger, is considered the founder of what became known as the new liturgical movement. But what it started out as is not how it ended up. A number of decades after his death, another Benedictine, Dom Baudat, took up the reins of the cause with an eye to transforming the liturgy itself. This was a departure from what Guéranger had thought. Guéranger had wanted to make the people understand, help them understand more the beauty and the depth of the Catholic Mass, to make it more meaningful to them so they would understand it more. That's how the new liturgical movement began. Baudat wanted to change the Mass itself, not get people's appreciation better, but to change the Mass itself in an effort to make it more ecumenical, more welcoming to Protestants. His thought was that if it was less Catholic, that more Protestants would say, oh, that seems kind of nice. Oh, that seems at home to me. I think I'll go to that. As a lead-up to this, Baudat, experimented with all sorts of innovations in the Mass. He used to hold what he called these things himself, his naughty little retreats, where he would collect various like-minded priests and invent changes in the Mass. So they'd go off to these little places, these like remote places, and sit together and have like a little committee and figure out what changes to make in the Mass, and then they'd go through the Mass and celebrate the Mass with their little changes in it. These were happening in forests, monasteries or retreat centers buried deep in the forests of France and things like that. Word got out about this. His critics called them little orgies of liturgical ecumenism. Whatever the term, they were laboratories of change. Baudat is important to this whole discussion only insofar as what he does is he opens the door to changing the liturgy, changing the Mass, so that it could be more accepted by Protestants. That's why he's important in this. He died in 1960, but before he died, his idea and those of others had already crept in and began popping up here and there. We have a number of pictures here for you. Look at the monitors, please. These pictures were taken in the United States in various parishes in the 1950s. 1950s, some of them are from South Dakota. What was being experimented with, remember, this is 10 years or so before Vatican II and 12 to 15 years before the new Mass begins. But what do you see? Here's a couple bringing up the gifts. That never happens in the Tridentine Mass. Over here on the right, you see a picture of two young first communicants, little 7, 8-year-old boys, bringing up the gifts to who? Cardinal Cushing in Boston in the 1950s. A couple other pictures we have. This is a Mass celebrated in a parish in South Dakota, and I believe it was 1954. I might be wrong on the year, but in the mid-50s, where the priest is actually facing the people. No ad orientem. This is 10, 15 years before the new Mass comes in. A couple other pictures we have here. On the left, you see nuns processing up the aisle, bringing up the gifts. Same thing in the middle picture. On the right-hand side, you see the priest, the main celebrant, going to the nuns right at the sanctuary and receiving the gifts. So these things were going on for a while. There was also a change to the liturgies of Holy Week. That happened in 1955. So the whole point of this is just to say that the liturgical changes that came roaring out of Vatican II didn't just drop out of the sky. They didn't come out of nowhere. They were already cropping up here and there. Now, there's a period in the Church, particularly in the beginning of the 20th century, where the term liturgical reform meant something very different depending on who you were talking to. Remember, you've got two understandings of this. Liturgical reform, meaning reform the people's understanding of the Mass so they can more beautifully appreciate it, versus reform the Mass itself. Two different schools of thought here. It didn't necessarily mean changing the liturgy, as we said, at least not significantly. It also meant reforming the sense of what the liturgy was all about. helping the laity to come to a much deeper appreciation of what is actually going on at Mass, what we call the theology of the Mass. Now, this is key. The Mass is a participation in the sacrifice of Jesus Christ to his Father for the redemption of mankind. That's why there's a priest. A priest offers sacrifice. This is why Protestant denominations don't have priests, because there's no sacrifice. What's offered in the Catholic Mass is Jesus Christ himself, his body and blood, soul and divinity, under the appearance of bread and wine. That is the central holding for the Catholic Mass, the sacrifice of the Mass. This is done in imitation of Christ himself, who instituted the Holy Eucharist in the moments before his passion and death. He did this in the context of a meal, as we know, the Last Supper. But the context of how he did it is not more important than what he did. It's that he was introducing himself, and this was a representation, a representation in advance, in anticipation of what was going to happen on Calvary. And it was something he gives to the church from time immemorial. That's the point of it. The point that it happens in a meal, in the setting of a meal, is not as important as the fact that there is a sacrifice going on. Then Cardinal Ratzinger said, the Eucharist that Christians celebrate really cannot adequately be described by the term meal. But if you go into tons of Catholic parishes these days, what do you hear? Oh, it's the supper. Oh, it's the meal. It's the supper meal. The word sacrifice you barely hear anymore. You barely hear anymore. So the emphasis is no longer on sacrifice, but it's on the meal. Indeed, if the sacrificial victim, as we understand this, is the sacrificial victim, and this is back from the Old Testament as well, if the sacrificial victim is not eaten, then the idea of the sacrifice being participated in doesn't happen. So the idea of a meal or supper is secondary to the sacrifice itself. That is Catholic theology, and that's what the entire Mass is built on, that theology. This is where Protestant and Catholic understanding of what happened in the upper room the night before Jesus' passion start to separate. And, as chance would have it, it's this dispute over the understanding of the liturgy where this reform, which way the reform goes, starts to break apart. Is it a sacrifice or is it a supper? Some wanted to change the emphasis of the Mass, while others wanted to improve the understanding of the Mass. It's very key to understand this. This becomes a whole sore point when people start arguing. The so-called conservatives and liberals start arguing. Change, change, change. Well, what's the change for? The change is to make us more appreciative of what's going on, or is it to just change the Mass? So be very careful when you hear the word change. It means two different things depending on which side you're talking to. As history has proved out, the one camp that won this was the one that wanted to change the Mass, not the one that wanted to make us more appreciative and understanding of the theology. When Vatican II began in 1962 under Pope John the 23rd, liturgical reform was just one of the items that was up for discussion and up for change by the Council Fathers. It was, however, though, in fact, the very first reform to come out of the Council. And it was largely driven by a group known as the Periti. Now, we mentioned those earlier. We had a quote from one of them. Periti were liturgical experts. The word Periti is Italian for expert. And they were extremely influential behind the scenes of what was going on at Vatican II. They were the ones who had the ideas in their minds of what should happen to the Mass, what the changes should be in the Mass. Now, they didn't have any power themselves, but one English fellow by the name of Douglas Woodruff, he was an outstanding English Catholic scholar, and he was editor of the newspaper, the British newspaper, The Tablet, during Vatican II. He said, "For in a sense, this council has been the council of the Periti, silent in the aula, but so effective in the commissions and at the bishop's ears." Catholic bishop of the counties of Cork and Ross in Ireland, Bishop Lucy, said, quote, "The Periti were more powerful than most bishops, even though they had no vote, because they had the ear of a cardinal or the head of a national group of bishops, and they were influential in drafting the council documents." He said the expert is the person with the power. The first document to come out of the council was entitled Sacrosanctum Concilium. It means the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy. It was promulgated on December 4th, 1963. What this document actually says becomes the whole sore point, the whole source of the heated debate that starts going on in the church and still goes on when people are running around in parishes. Oh, Vatican II said this, and Vatican II said that. Really? Have you read the document? And this is where our discussion must turn to a man by the name of Father Annibale Bugnini. He is the one figure who is crucial to our understanding of the changes that occurred in the Mass. So let's talk about him. First, the man. While it has never been completely established that he was a Freemason, he himself actually denied it up until his death. Leading intellectuals in the church, not the least of which were Dietrich von Hildebrand and his wife Alice, as well as many, many others, are convinced that he was a Freemason. Freemasonry was first condemned by Pope Clement XII in 1738 with a papal bull. Catholics were forbidden from joining Masonic lodges. The reason is that Freemasonry is a secret society opposed to many teachings of the Catholic Church. In fact, it is condemned outright as a force bent on destruction of the Catholic Church, not just a contrary opinion. According to Pope Pius XII in 1958, the roots of modern apostasy, listen to the language he's using, the roots of modern apostasy lay in scientific atheism, dialectical materialism, rationalism, Illuminism, laicism, and Freemasonry, which is the mother of them all. In fact, since 1738, and this is according to the Masons themselves, 8 popes have condemned Freemasons 17 times and reiterating the ban on another 400 occasions. And this condemnation has never been revoked. As a matter of fact, it was recently restated by then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, obviously Pope Benedict now, when he was prefect for the Congregation for Doctrine of the Faith, the CDF. He said, the Church's negative judgment in regard to Masonic association remains unchanged, since their principles have always been considered irreconcilable with the doctrine of the Church, and therefore membership in them remains forbidden. The faithful who enroll in Masonic associations are in a state of grave sin and may not receive Holy Communion. So if anybody tells you the Freemason thing is, oh, we're kind of all buddies and chums now, yeah, let bygones be bygones. Well, the bygones haven't bygoned, they're still here. If Bugnini was a Freemason, and like I said, many, many people believe he was, if he was a Freemason, and the suspicion, as we said, is much more than just idle Roman gossip, then the changes that occurred in the Mass now take on something of a sinister nature. If he was a Freemason, then he was actively trying to destroy the Church by destroying the life of the faithful, by destroying the Mass, by introducing all of these changes into the Mass. Bugnini was the man who had the single greatest influence on the changes in the Mass. And we're going to show you how. This is how. About 15 years before Vatican II begins, Bugnini began intensive liturgical studies. He kind of became something of a liturgical expert. In 1948, he was appointed the secretary of Pope Pius XII's Commission for Liturgical Reform. In 1956, he became consultor to the Sacred Congregation of Rites. Now remember, 1956, we're starting to get up to Vatican II. Pope John the 23rd isn't there yet. The council hasn't been called, but he is moving to the forefront of the liturgical movement. In 1957, he becomes professor of sacred liturgy at the Lateran University in Rome. 2 years later, in 1959, Pope John the 23rd calls for the Second Vatican Council. And in 1960, he places Father Bugnini in a position which enables him to exert incredible influence on the future of the Catholic liturgy. He was appointed secretary to the Preparatory Commission for the Liturgy of the Second Vatican Council. In other words, he's the guy in charge of the committee that's looking at all of the changes in the Mass. He becomes the top dog, in effect, sort of the general on the ground. He was the driving force behind the drafting of what's called the preparatory schema, the plan in preparation for putting it together. This group, this preparatory commission, took suggestions and different schemas and plans from all sorts of people, put them all together, looked at them, and then produced one schema, one plan, and that's what gets presented. This draft document, the draft document on the liturgy, is the one that was to be eventually be placed before the council, before the Second Vatican Council, for the fathers of the council to discuss. It was referred to by some as the Bonini schema, by his admirers actually, and was accepted as the document, the schema, that was produced by the Liturgical Preparatory Commission. That vote was taken on January 13th, 1962. It was his document. They had all these documents. His document, no surprise there, he was the head of the commission. His document is the one that comes out of this commission as, here are our suggested changes to the Mass. The Liturgy Constitution, which the Council Fathers eventually voted on, was substantially identical to Bonini's draft schema. Now, it should be noted that there were substantial misgivings about the plan from the beginning, but for reasons that we can never really seem to know, and all of these different authors never seem to really nail it down, and it seems to be lost to history, or we just don't know. But for whatever reason, Bonini was able to overcome whatever opposition he had, and he had a lot of opposition to his plan. In either case, whatever happens, on December 4th, 1963, as we've noted, the Second Vatican Council adopts and approves Bonini's plan for changes to the Mass. So what were Bonini's thoughts about the changes in the Mass? His own thoughts, him personally? We must strip from our Catholic prayers and from the Catholic liturgy everything which can be the shadow of a stumbling block for our separated brethren, that is, for the Protestants. This is the guy who formed the new Mass. Now that quote is extremely telling. He gave it to Osservatore Romano, the Vatican newspaper, in 1965. Now the question's been out there all this time if Bonini was actually concerned with making the Mass more Protestant-friendly, or whether he was just using that as a cover for a Freemason plan to actually destroy the Mass. Now, we don't really think the answer to that's ever going to be known. As we said, he himself denied that he was a Freemason right up to his death. But whatever his motives, and like we said, there's no way to know what his intention was. One thing is absolutely certain. This one man set out on a course to so alter the Catholic Mass that at the very least it would lose practically any dimension whatsoever of being authentic Catholic worship. He said it himself. Strip away everything that's Catholic to make it more Protestant friendly. A very, very close associate of him, as a matter of fact, his secretary, said of his former boss, he accepted and embraced secularism because he said it was reality, and it was necessary to accept reality. He held to the modern philosophical view that man is made without God. This is an archbishop. That man is made without God and does not need God. That was made by his secretary, Abbot Boniface Lux, speaking about him in an Inside the Vatican interview not so many years ago. As to the curious question of whether he was a Freemason bent on destroying the Mass, a serious issue, some series of events happened which really started to feed this understanding or this suspicion. Very shortly after his schema is adopted by the Preparatory Commission, Bonini was suddenly removed as the secretary to that same commission and lost his professorship at the Lateran University in the same case. That happened in early 1962, very shortly after his schema is adopted by the Preparatory Commission. Because of who he was and what he was doing, nobody really believes that these moves could have been made without the knowledge and probably the consent and permission of John the 23rd. Most likely his consent. So stripped of his power, it looks like in early 1962 that Bonini just has sort of moved off the stage, he's lost all of his authority. However, not very shortly after that, John the 23rd dies, Pope Paul VI is elected, and he appoints Bonini as secretary of the official body to implement the changes to the Mass that Bonini himself has guided through the Preparatory Commission 2 years earlier. So in 1964, 2 years after being canned, he became the secretary of the Commission for the Implementation of the Constitution on the Liturgy. That's big, large Roman speak for a body referred to as the Concilium. Now, no one seems to know why he'd been dismissed by one pope and almost immediately reappointed by another. In either case, he was now in a very powerful position to push through the very plan that he had written himself 2 years earlier. Now, a word real quickly about Pope Paul VI here. According to our sources who had direct contact and access to Pope Paul VI, and had private audiences with him with no one else in attendance except them and the Holy Father. Pope Paul was sort of a weak-willed man. This is not talking about his holiness. It's not talking about his intentions. This is talking about his constitution. He was a weak-willed man who they believed was easily manipulated. He totally supported the idea of getting rid of the Tridentine Mass, the traditional Latin Mass, from the outset. He wanted it gone. And it was only some very strange quirk that actually kept him from totally eliminating it. When word began circulating that he was about to totally abrogate the Tridentine Mass, to totally blow it up, a number of prominent Catholics wrote a personal letter to him asking him not to do so. According to reports, it was the presence of Agatha Christie's name on the list of people who'd signed the letter that he said, oh, he sort of jumped out and was like, oh, Agatha Christie? And so for the sake of the Catholics, most of them English, Catholics on this letter, he did not totally abrogate the Mass. So the Mass was never done away with. For those of you who've sat in parishes, people here in the TV studio audience, or people sitting at home watching this, the traditional Latin Mass, the Tridentine Mass, was never abrogated. That's a point you hear constantly. Oh, we won't do that old Mass anymore. That old Mass was never abrogated. So, he was also heavily influenced by the French philosopher Jacques Maritain, who was a well-renowned Thomist philosopher, but also had some sort of decidedly leftist thoughts when it came to social teachings. When Dietrich von Hildebrand made a personal appeal to Pope Paul to beware of the changes of the Mass, and I have to share this with you, we got this information we're telling you right now directly from the mouth of Alice von Hildebrand herself. She said her husband Dietrich went to Paul VI when all of this was happening and said this is going to destroy the faith, that this is horrible, it's going to wreck the faith of Catholics, that the theology of the Mass has been gone and substituted with something else. When he told Paul VI that, Paul angrily dismissed him and told him, and he and his concerns, just be quiet. That's right from the mouth of Alice von Hildebrand. She said it really, really greatly disturbed Dietrich. And that's when his writings changed. A lot of the stuff before that was very philosophical-oriented, wonderful, deep, beautiful things that Pope Pius XII referred to him as a doctor of the church, called him the doctor of love. He's a wonderful, wonderful man, great deep thinker. But when all of this started happening to the Mass, you see a big shift in his writings. And he starts writing different books over here, like the Trojan Horse and the City of God. And he starts talking about what's going on inside the church now. And that becomes a shifting point, a change for him. So the big picture we have here is somewhat mysterious. A priest, Annibale Bugnini, with a decidedly reform-minded agenda. Some would say, because he's a Freemason, that he wanted to destroy the Mass. He gets his plan adopted by the council that he is secretary for. Shortly afterwards, he loses all his authority. Shortly after and then his plan gets accepted by the Second Vatican Council. Shortly after that, John the 23rd dies. Pope Paul VI comes in, reappoints him, and puts him in charge of the committee to implement and interpret the very plan he wrote 2 years earlier. That's how this whole thing swims through. Suddenly, bishops and lay people become alarmed at what they see going on. They appeal to the Pope. They're dismissed. And in the meantime, a new Mass is being engineered that almost totally downplays all Catholic worship in favor of a Protestant-friendly approach. That's what was going on in the church in Rome. Now, this is an extremely important point, and I need to stress this. No one, certainly not us, no one is saying that the new Mass is not valid. Let's hammer this point home. The validity of a sacrament is, did the sacrament happen? When it comes to the case of the Mass, the Eucharist is the bread and wine consecrated and turned into the body and blood of Jesus, body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus, or is it not? Yes, it is. No one is saying the new Mass is not valid. No one is saying when you go up to receive Holy Communion that you're not actually receiving Jesus. Yes, you are. It is a valid Mass. We're not talking about the validity. We're talking about, is this authentic Catholic worship? Is this how Catholics worship God? Is this a break from the past that's so violent that you can't really say this is authentic Catholic worship as we have understood it? has the theology behind the Mass been so manipulated and twisted and deformed that Catholics going to this Mass miss something of the theology compared to talking about the traditional Latin Mass, the Tridentine Mass. That's what's at issue, not is it valid or not. To make a point, you can receive a sacrament validly and in the process still have your faith endangered. I'll give you an example. If you go to confession, and let's say you go to confession and you are confessing that you have committed adultery, and you have in fact committed adultery, and you go and receive absolution, and you know, if you receive absolution and you're contrite and all the normal things that happen with confession, is the confession valid? Yes. Have you been absolved? Yes. Has the sin gone away? Yes. All that's the case. But if the priest says to you at the end of it, oh, and by the way, don't worry, that's not really a sin. You know, I know your wife, and she's not the nicest lady around, so you can go ahead and have a get out of adultery free card. Your faith has been damaged. Is the sacrament valid? Yes. Has your faith been damaged? On the other hand, yes. We're not talking about the validity of the Mass. It is Jesus. The bread and wine are consecrated. It is Jesus. We're talking about, is this authentic Catholic worship? Is what's going on behind the scenes a possible detriment to your faith? That's the question. That's what Dietrich von Hildebrand's asking. That's what Alice von Hildebrand is asking. That's what Peter Stravinsky is asking. That's what all of these people who've written all of these books are asking. Is this a danger? What's going on? This is the point of this show. That's the point of all of these writings, all of these articles. This is why Pope Benedict is saying we need a reform of the reform. If there was no problem with the Mass, as we now experience it in most of our daily parishes in America and all over the world, with the Novus Ordo, the new Mass, if there was no problem with it, there would be no call from Rome to revisit this. All of these brilliant minds would not have written thousands and thousands of pages about this. We're not creating this. We're simply echoing everything they've thought and what we've been researching for hundreds of hours. And if the Holy Father himself says, wow, we really need to fix some things up here, then this is an issue worth looking at. And that's why we're doing this show. Protestants who were at the council as observers and were very familiar with the documents were surprised themselves at how much of an extent the documents accepted Protestant theology. One Anglican bishop, John Mormon, he was one of the Protestant observers. Listen to what he said. In reading the schema on the liturgy, that's the Bugnini plan that gets accepted by the council, I could not help but thinking that if the Church of Rome, lovely expression, the Church of Rome were to carry out all of the reforms proposed, they would one day find they had triumphantly invented the Anglican Book of Common Prayer. That's from an Anglican. He reads the thing and goes, oh, well, look at that. A Protestant professor of dogmatic theology at Strasbourg, M.G. Siegwald, said, nothing in the renewed Mass need really trouble the evangelical Protestant. These are Protestants assessing the Mass going, hey, rock on, Catholics. Took you 500 years, but you caught up to us finally. Good for you. Those reactions are precisely why all of these people wrote all of these books. It's what drove von Hildebrand to Pope Paul VI and said, whoa, put the brakes on this. This is what's been going on for 40, 50 years. According to the man who essentially developed the Novus Ordo, the new Mass, the Mass most of us attend each week in our parishes, it had to be stripped of anything Catholic that would be a problem for Protestants. In short, the prayer, the public worship of the new Mass, the question is it more Protestant or more Catholic? That is a very, very key question. Remember our opening quote? Lex orandi, lex credendi. It's not all of it. We pulled back one line. It is in its completion, lex orandi, lex credendi, lex vivendi. How you pray is how you believe, is how you live. There's a connection between our prayer, our belief, and our actions. Of course there is. That's the point. In Catholic theology, the model of prayer you use will impact what you believe and how you live. So, this is the cheery part of the show. Let's look at some numbers so we can see what has happened to how Catholics believe and how they live. Since the introduction of the new Mass in 1969, the Novus Ordo, enrollment in Catholic religious seminaries worldwide, these are religious orders worldwide, has dropped precipitously. Hold on to your seats. For example, Jesuit enrollment has plummeted 89%. In 1965, this is the Jesuits, there were 3,559 seminarians. In the year 2000, 10 years ago, there were 389. An 89% drop. Now, as an aside, many people will think, well, that's not so horrible. It is the Jesuits, after all. But it's telling. The Franciscans dropped from 2,251 to just 60 worldwide in 2000. The La Salette seminarians went from 552 to 1, a drop of 99.8%. The Oblates of Mary Immaculate also experienced the floor dropping out from underneath them. In 1965, they had 914 seminarians. In the year 2000, they had 13, a drop of 99%. And the Redemptorist order saw their seminarian numbers simply dry up also. 1,128 seminarians worldwide in 1965, 24 in the year 2000, a 98% drop. Now, overall, as we look at America, adding together all the religious order seminarians, the Jesuits, Franciscans, Dominicans, all of that, and the regular diocesan seminarians, there has been a 58% drop, more than half in 2 generations. In 1965, there were 6,000 seminarians. In 2010, 3,500. 3,500. That's for all of America, all religious orders, all diocesan. Anybody who would be ordained in this pipeline, no matter where you're from, in America, that's your full number, 3,500. Remember, those 3,500 seminarians aren't all ordained yet. Just because they're in the seminary doesn't mean they're going to turn out and become priests. Many of them will leave, find their vocation lays elsewhere. 3,500 seminarians does not mean 3,500 priests. Of those who were ordained, 1,575 men were ordained to the priesthood in 1965. In 2002, this is all priests in America. In 1 year, 450. A drop of over 70%. Now, that's the sorry state of affairs when it comes to laymen becoming priests. The story is even worse when it comes to women studying to be religious sisters. Look at these numbers. According to Georgetown Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate, a wonderful group known as CARA, in 1965 there were nearly 180,000 women religious. In 2002, there were just over 67,000. A 62% drop, 2/3 of a reduction in women religious. These are gigantic numbers, and it's a trend. If you look at the women currently, the average age is, they're almost 70. The average age is almost 70. If you were to make this number from 2002 to 2020, which is 10 years from now, these numbers would almost be gone. They'll all be dead or exceedingly, exceedingly old. Let's take a look at what happened to the laity in general. In the United States, prior to the new Mass being introduced, over 75% of Catholics attended Mass each week. 75%, 3 out of 4, is unheard of to not go to Mass. Today, 23% of Catholics in America go to Mass each week. A considerable drop, 65%. Less than 1 in 4 Catholics in the United States now goes to Mass. In Italy, it's only slightly better. It's only 30%. In France, the eldest daughter of the church, Charlemagne, the year 800, receiving the crown and becoming Holy Roman Emperor. France, the eldest daughter of the church, 12% of Catholics go to Mass each week. And in Ireland, less than 50% go to Mass once a month. Once a month. We could go on, but you get the picture. The faith has been eviscerated in these 40 years, and the decline has coincided with the new Mass. How you pray is how you live, is how you believe. In study after study, Catholics have become Protestant in their views of theology and morality. According to CBS News, 70% do not believe in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. This is of Catholics. Over 90% reject the Church's teaching on contraception. Catholics are simply indistinguishable from the rest of America in the rates in which they abort, divorce, and cohabit. Poll after poll shows that Catholic youth under the age of 30 may be more pro-life than their parents are, but they are decidedly more accepting of homosexuality. Half of all Catholic high schools in America, half have closed since 1965. Half. The number of Catholics between 18 and 30 that attend Mass each week has simply disappeared. Less than 5% of Catholics between the ages of 18 and 30 go to Mass. 95% of that group doesn't go to Mass. And for people who want to sit back and say, oh, don't be so concerned about those numbers, they'll get married, they'll have children, when that happens, they come back. No, they don't. A very recent poll was just conducted about a month and a half ago that says, you know what? That's a fairy tale. They do not come back. They do not come back. Marriage, kids, does not bring them back to the church. You could simply ask yourselves, well, if they grew up in all of this, and if they're under 30, they did, what would they feel this great pressing need to come back to? There's no denying that since the new Mass, the Church, in its Catholic character, in its public worship and living out of the faith by the laity, has simply been wiped off the map. So devastated has the faith become that when he was still Cardinal Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI said the churches may simply have to become smaller and live in isolated little pockets like it did back in the beginning centuries of the church. In fact, in 1997, he said, I am convinced that the crisis in the church that we are experiencing is to a large extent due to the disintegration of the liturgy. When the community of faith, the worldwide unity of the church and her history, and the mystery of the living Christ are no longer visible in the liturgy, where else then is the church to become visible in her spiritual essence? Then the community is celebrating only itself, an activity that is utterly fruitless. What's he describing? He's describing Protestant services. That's what he's describing, where you just get together and kind of celebrate yourself. Let's recall again how all of this came about. This is the mechanism, how all of these changes came into the Mass. In the course of review now, in 1960, Bonini is appointed secretary to the Preparatory Commission, responsible for drafting the documents that will be presented to the full council. In his role, he draws up his schema, the Bonini schema, which is accepted by the Commission. Bonini's schema is then presented to the Council Fathers, who vote to accept it in December of 1963. Once official, its name changes from the so-called Bonini schema to Sacrosanctum Concilium, the first document of Vatican II. In 1964, the Concilium was established, the body, the group that was in charge of this, was established to implement Sacrosanctum Concilium. This was the body that Bonini was in charge of. Remember now, the document is the same one that he had written and drawn up himself 2 years earlier. Now, secretary to this body, he would also have oversight in implementing it and it being promulgated to the world. That's how this whole thing happened. This dual role of writing the document in 1962, which is eventually accepted by the Council Fathers, and then interpreting and implementing it starting in 1964, prompted one cardinal from England, John Heenan, to say, God forbid that the people who wrote the document would also be the ones who advanced it. But that is exactly what in fact did happen. In 1967, after a series of small incremental changes, Bonini unveils his vision for the new Mass to a synod of bishops in the Sistine Chapel right under Michelangelo's glorious frescoes. He unveils his Mass. Here it is, folks. We've had the Tridentine Mass, but here is the Bonini Mass. And reports are that this Mass was so repulsive and so disturbing that more than half of the bishops simply got up and walked out of the Mass. Precise changes that they found to be so disturbing, it's kind of a matter of debate. If you read through all of these things in different articles, you'll hear this, and then somebody will say, well, no, it wasn't this, it was that. But the point was, no one challenges the fact that a huge number of bishops got up and walked out and said, whoa, this isn't Mass. This isn't the Mass that we know. This isn't even close to it. What we do know is that there was this huge consternation and upset about what he did actually change. One bishop made these comments when he finished asking Bonini about his radical changes. This bishop said he, Bonini, spoke absolutely as if there had never been a Mass in the church before him. He spoke of his normative Mass as a new invention. Those comments were later echoed by people like Cardinal Ratzinger when he said, "In the place of liturgy as the fruit of development came fabricated liturgy. We abandoned the organic living process of growth and development over the centuries and replaced it, as in a manufacturing process, with a fabrication, a banal on-the-spot product." Look who's making these comments. Despite all the various objections, when it came time to being voted on by the bishops, it was passed. 71 bishops voted to approve, 43 voted not approved. That's hardly a ringing endorsement. And 62 approved with reservations, some of them very serious reservations. Nonetheless, after this, 2 years later, and this is the Mass that they saw inside the Sistine Chapel in 1967. 2 years later, in 1969, on April 3rd, Pope Paul VI officially promulgates this Mass, the Bonini Mass, with little to no changes to the one presented in the Sistine Chapel. The official document is called the Apostolic Constitution on the New Roman Missal and was the groundwork for the Mass we see today in all of our regular parishes. Archbishop Bonini crowed about this in 1974. He said, "The liturgical reform is a major conquest of the Catholic Church, and it has ecumenical dimensions, since the other churches and Christian denominations see in it not only something to be admired in itself, but equally as a sign of further progress to come." Notice what he says here, since the other churches and Christian denominations, there is no such thing as other churches. And we, the Catholic Church, are not one of a number of denominations. Protestant ecclesial communities are denominations. We are not. We are the original church that goes back to Jesus Christ himself, founded on Peter. This is an archbishop equating Protestant groups that he's incorrectly calling churches with the Catholic Church, as though, oh, now we're all the same and we can all get together and hold hands and do our stuff together. And he's wrong. And Pope Benedict XVI, when he was still the head of CDF, corrected this understanding that we're all churches. No, there is one church. Our Blessed Lord founded one church, and it's the Catholic Church. Everything else is an ecclesial community. But there's more. The wording of this document is so vague in many places, and some people think it was deliberately written that way, that they actually accused Bonini of making it vague so that people could come around later and interpret it whatever way they wanted to. That not only the theology behind it is questionable, but the various implementations can be considered vague and open to wild interpretations. Now, Cardinal John Heenan, again, the same one who said, oh, please don't let the people who wrote this be the ones who implemented it. He said, he was Archbishop of Westminster, by the way, he said of the document, a determined group could wear down opposition and produce a formula patient of both an orthodox and a modernistic interpretation. Yeah, boy, did those words come true. It was precisely because of all of this ambiguity and room for interpretation that many viewed the changes as a threat to the faith of Catholics in the pews. And this is where a cardinal named Alfredo Ottaviani, as well as another cardinal, Antonio Bacci, became so alarmed they produced their own document and presented it to Pope Paul VI just as the changes were starting to be made. His documents become known as the Ottaviani intervention, like, whoa, stop, I want to intervene here. You need to read this, Holy Father, you need to read this. It's a blistering analysis of Bonini's Mass. It stresses the point that the new Mass is a severe rupture from the past with its overemphasis on community, as well as a wild accommodation of Protestant theology. The Mass, for example, in Bonini's document is constantly referred to as a supper. In fact, it is defined by Bonini as a supper in his document at the expense of the idea of sacrifice. In the area of the purpose for the Mass, the ultimate purpose for the Mass is the sacrifice of praise rendered to the Holy Trinity. That's the ultimate purpose. The ordinary purpose of the Mass is to make satisfaction to God for sin. That's what Catholic theology has always maintained. But these purposes don't even appear in the Bonini schema or anything. They don't. Those distinctions aren't even there. Those purposes don't even exist. The new Mass stresses the nourishment and the sanctification of the faithful. Old Mass, worship and adoration to the Holy Trinity, the removal of sin. Here, hey, we're all nourished and getting along together. Two entirely different structures here. The intervention takes special exception, as a matter of fact, Ottaviani's intervention takes special exception to the term bread of life and spiritual drink. As in, blessed are you, Lord, God of all creation, through your goodness, we have this bread or wine to offer. It will become for us the bread of life or our spiritual drink. Those two expressions, according to the intervention, are so utterly vague, they could mean anything. In fact, with the reduction of the Mass from a sacrifice to a supper, this is a quote from the intervention, with its de-emphasis on the sacrificial nature and overemphasis on the community, the Mass will turn into a philanthropist's meeting or a charity banquet. That was Cardinal Ottaviani's analysis or assessment of the Novus Ordo. The language used in the new Mass confuses nearly every aspect of the Mass. The idea of sacrifice, who's actually offering the sacrifice. The understanding now in so many Catholic parishes is that we all offer the sacrifice as a community. No, we don't. That's what the priest does. That's why the priest is a priest. The idea of an altar versus a table. Come up around the table of the Lord. Remember that song in the 60s? Gather round the table of the Lord. Yeah, I know that'll be the last time I do that. The total absence of the word transubstantiation. With all of these confusions, the very nature of the faith itself is undermined. This is what Ottaviani was stressing. So the former theology is largely dismissed and substituted. But the question is, what is it substituted with? When that old theology, the Catholic theology, is gone, something else is brought in. What is the something else? That's what we're going to talk about when we come back. We're going to have on stage a very, very knowledgeable priest who knows an awful lot about this and is going to sit and ask him a few questions, and we'll hear his responses to what's going on with the Mass. We'll be right back right after this.